Well, welcome back to the Bible Nerd Show, where we believe that understanding the Bible in its historic, geographic, religious, and cultural context helps us see Jesus more clearly, love him more dearly, and follow him more nearly day by day. We are a preacher, a teacher, and your average Joe talking about season 1, episode 8 of The Chosen. I am he. So after a miraculous visit to Simon's house, Jesus and his students leave Capernaum while under pressure from religious and Roman authorities, and Jesus makes a surprise stop at Jacob's well for an important encounter. How are you guys doing before we dive in? How are you guys doing today?
Lucas is exhausted because he's the parent of a toddler.
Yes. Yep. That is accurate. I'm the parent of a toddler, and I have a wife who's 27 weeks pregnant. So,
Both of those will combine to be less sleep for Lucas.
but I have great coffee, and that's what counts.
There you go.
That's awesome.
What coffee is it?
This is one I'm trying to think of.
It's mushroom coffee, isn't it? You drink it. You're one of those guys, aren't you?
It's
mushroom
coffee. Yeah, it's mud water. No, this is a coffee that is farmed by a believer who's in Brazil. The coffee's made, like, I can tell you so many things about the coffee. Elevation is at 4,900 feet. It's got a bunch of nice, rich, dark chocolatey notes. And it's a little nutty. It's quite wonderful. Brew temp is about 200 degrees. But I cannot tell you the name of the coffee company because it's escaping me. They sponsor some of my friends that record some podcasts at our studio, and they left some for me. So I can tell you everything about their coffee except for the name of it.
Except for the name of it.
I'll throw it in. I'll give it to Nate so he can put it in the show notes.
There we go.
Perfect. I had, speaking of Brazilian coffee, so I used to own a coffee brand that was in Southern California, and we had a Brazilian blend, and it was called Brazilian Love. And so we had t-shirts. We had t-shirts made that said "Make Brazilian Love," and people just, the most odd looks that you'd get. We were actually at an event, and Snoop Dogg was there, and like all these guys, and they wanted our t-shirts. So that I think you can find pictures of Snoop Dogg wearing a "Make Brazilian Love" t-shirt. That's where it comes from. It's good coffee.
That was not how I saw this episode start.
No, not at all.
No, it's different kind of love that we're going to be talking about, I think.
I hope so. All right.
Nathan, you can cut that whole segment. Well, let's dive into what's your what are you guys' high level take on this episode, season 8, the finale of season 1?
Let you go first, Lucas.
Man, I dug it. The story, the way that they're portraying it, it comes to a very nice conclusion for the end of season 1. There's enough familiarity with the stories that are being told, and the context that is given to it, mixed with enough of, I think, the poetic liberty, or the directorial license that we've been talking about kind of throughout this entire series, that it keeps the story moving forward. It makes me interested to see what's going to happen in season 2. And I think it would be really difficult to choose the moment in this one. I think that there are probably 2 or 3 that you could go to in this episode. And I think that maybe makes it for me the strongest episode of the season.
Wow. Well, and just the song at the end, right? The outro with it, I thought was really cool. But same thing for me. So this episode, I think there's so many elements that are very powerful. I will tell you probably the first couple of times that I watched this, the moment that I'll talk about, I was in tears. Like, it was so moving and so powerful to me. So I'm excited to hear what your guys' moments are too. But David, high level overview for you with this episode.
Well, there's so many things in it that were good, and some of it's completely extra biblical, and it had to have it as part of the story because of the narrative choices that they made in previous episodes, which we talked about specifically regarding Nicodemus. With that, I loved the dinner scene with Matthew and the tax collectors and everybody else, and the way Jesus handles that, and when the Pharisees try to criticize and come in, and the way Jesus responds, I feel like that's a really beautiful thing. I love the tension in that scene, specifically between Simon and Matthew, which makes perfect sense, both narratively within the story that they chose to tell in this series, but also just practically with understanding who Matthew was, as we've talked about before. I have been waiting for this moment. I did not realize until this episode started that this episode was going to really center around the Samaritan woman at the well. And so, but I've been waiting for whenever they decided to get to that story, because I read that story so differently than the way it was always basically interpreted for us growing up and in church and things like that. You know, there's this very religious conversation from the way it was presented to me originally was the woman's just blown away by the unbelievable insight that Jesus is portraying, you know, showing, and all of this. And then I mentioned on a previous episode, I spent years just trying to immerse myself in the Gospels, and I've seen when I read the Gospels, I see Jesus with an unbelievable sense of humor. I see Jesus sarcastic at times. I see Jesus very much like you and I, and the way he interacts with people. So much so that, like, one of my favorite moments in the entire Bible is when Jesus heals a man born mute and then tells him he can't go tell anybody. I think that's hilarious. I think that's funny with that, right? And I think that there's religious elements to it, but I also read it and I think, imagine being the mute guy walking away going, but wait, all of that. So I always saw the interaction between the Samaritan woman and Jesus as her being very sarcastic with him.
Which is exactly how they portrayed it.
And the way, so when they portrayed that sarcasm back from her, I was just like, yes, thank you. You know, that is the way I read this passage. I read this woman as being hard, cynical, jaded, knowing her religion from her own people, knowing the differences with the Jewish version of those things, and just sick of dealing with all of this. And she's just not taking it from this Jew that's there, and she's going to push back on him. And I don't see Jesus being threatened at all by her sarcasm. And I loved the way that they did that. So that was huge for me.
So they captured your understanding of this moment, you know, just, I mean, to the T. As you're describing that, it's like you could have written that episode. I mean, it was that well played. And yeah, you're right. Like exactly when, and even when Jesus says that, and I know I'm jumping forward a little bit, but you know, when he's talking to Fortina, right, the woman at the well, and he's like, if you knew the water that I had, you'd be asking me for a drink, you know, and then when the disciples come back and he goes, oh, I have food that you don't even know of. You know, I love it. He's like on a roll. He's like, I'm just going to keep going with this one. So I thought there were some really fun elements. So, you know, the episode opens up, you know, with ancient Israel, and you have, is it Jacob that's talking to, you know, some guy who's out in the field, you know, where this whole episode is kind of centered around at Jacob's well, thus getting its name of Jacob's well. And he's having a conversation with him. And I love how he's like, you know, so you choose this God who, you know, basically beats you up and you can't see and you can't name, you know, all this stuff. And then, you know, the water starts bubbling up from the well. And he's like, oh, I didn't choose him. He chose me. You know, I thought that was such a cool moment, you know, where God's, you know, coming through. But Lucas, you know, from your perspective, you know, from a biblical perspective, there's quite a bit in this episode, you know, for us to talk through. What were your perceptions, you know, as the biblical accuracy of this episode?
There were so many biblical references in this one that kind of run the gamut, Old Testament and New Testament. You know, when we open the episode, we've got Jacob digging a well, and we see a lot of this stuff that's going on, which would have been in Genesis 32 and 33, which set up for the ending with the Samaritan woman, and really what he's talking about is like the different experiences and things that he had, and then the digging of the well, which I think is interesting. When we look then and kind of fast forward to what happens in the episode, the stuff that's in the episode is kind of, again, like from a chronological standpoint, it's still kind of hopping all over the place. And we know that the Gospels, we've said this before, the Gospels are not written chronologically, but when we see things, and the way that the Chosen has portrayed it. So Matthew gets the call out of the tax collector's booth, and then we see immediately, sort of in Matthew chapter 9 verses 9 through 13, as Jesus went from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting in the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And while he was reclining at the table in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came to eat with him. So there's a lot that potentially happens between verses 9 and 10 in the scripture, and I think it does a good job of filling in those gaps, and then kind of moving the story along, particularly with the healing of Simon's mother-in-law, which is also something that didn't, that's out of when we look at like Luke chapter 4, 38 and 39, we see that, but it's not as impactful a story or a moment throughout the Gospels as it is in the show. And I really love the way that they did it in the show, because this would have been the healing of Simon, or Peter's mother-in-law, would have been something of tremendous significance to those men. Like, we can kind of brush over it and read past it whenever we read the Gospels, because it's not this really incredible healing. When we look at it in Luke 38 and 39, it says, after he left the synagogue, he entered Simon's house. Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever. Then they asked him about her. So he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. She immediately got up and began to serve them. And so it's this little kind of blurb that we can read and then move past. But the significance that it would have had to Simon, the significance that it would have had to the other disciples, Andrew, James, and John, who are, potentially cousins of Jesus, and are there because they know Peter and Andrew, because they worked together with Zebedee, with James and John's dad. That would have been a tremendous thing, particularly when we look at it as something that likely happened before they all began traveling and that kind of stuff. It is this like little bit of care. I say a little bit of care. It is a tremendous display of the care that Jesus had for his disciples of, if you're going to come with me, I'm going to make all things right at home before I take you away from your family, to let you know that I'm going to take care of them, because you've followed in obedience. So those things are really interesting. The portrayal of Nicodemus, this is one of those, I said that there are probably two or three things that could be the moment. The portrayal of Nicodemus giving money to the disciples and then being on the other side of the wall and weeping. I've read a lot of folks that see that as kind of being an allusion to the rich young ruler. Whereas the rich young ruler, the story goes that, want had a person who came to him and said, I'm righteous. I've kept all the commandments my entire life. And, I want to follow you. And Jesus goes, well, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then you can come and follow me. And he's heartbroken because he had many possessions. Where I don't see the congruency there, and where I would caution a lot of people that are conflating those things, is that one, Nicodemus did give, but he didn't follow. And the rich young ruler is not the only person that we see that does that. And so there are a lot of, I think, interesting parallels that could be drawn there, and maybe, that is part of the inspiration for it, but I wouldn't conflate those two things too much, because the difference in the heart behind it is that Nicodemus wants to go, but his thing that he's not giving up has nothing to do with his possessions. It literally has to do with, him sorting out what the calling of God is on his life. and that's a much different, I think, struggle and bit of turmoil between the two.
Hmm.
As far as the woman at the well goes, which is that last scene, I think, in agreement with David, that it is beautifully done. Um, I love not only the quippiness of Jesus, but I also really, really love the attitude that Fatina has. Now, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong here. So this story comes out of John chapter 4, particularly verses 4 through 26. And as I'm looking through this, I am not seeing that there is a name given to the woman at the well.
I
However,
didn't think there was.
in the Catholic tradition, Saint Fatina is the Samaritan woman. And
Oh,
so,
really?
so when we've talked about, yeah, and so um here's the deal that according to the pious tradition, Saint Fatina was the Samaritan woman to whom Jesus spoke at the well in John 4, 4 through 26. Accordingly, she is said to have been a believer in Jesus, to have spread the gospel, and eventually to have been martyred in Carthage. Another tradition has her called before the Emperor Nero and martyred in Rome. Um, so this idea that her name is Fatina is an incredibly Catholic idea. And this is one of those, if you go back and listen to episode 2 of the biblical considerations when watching The Chosen and the types of influences and things that are there, this is one for me that I think is interesting. I don't obviously it's extra biblical to give this lady this name. It is a bit of a nod to not just the Catholic Church, but to church tradition that this woman is Fatina, and that's why they name her the way that they do. I don't know that that we need to hang our hat on any of that stuff because there's not enough evidence to really make this the case. And even the writings that are about this being Fatina, they're all speculative. Like they think that this is probably her. It lines up kind of with a story about this other lady who's a martyr, and so they're drawing a very lightly dotted line, and or they're taking a very lightly dotted line, and they're running over it with Sharpie and saying, nope, this is definitely where those connections are made. So it is fascinating to see kind of where that name comes from and all of that, and to kind of have the context for it, because we do know that there are a lot of people of different denominational backgrounds that are part of this, as well as different sects of Christianity that whether traditional, atraditional, whether you believe that all of those groups can, within the context, I want to make sure that I word this properly, David, so you can clean up any mess that I'm about to make here. Within the context of their stated doctrine and theology, whether or not you can find the evidence that they have a good grasp of what is necessary for salvation or not. So I'll put it that way. That the influence that they're having on the show is incredibly evident in little bits and little scenes like this, for something as simple as the name, that is going to have incredible significance to people that are Catholic or that are Orthodox in those types of belief, because this is who they believe that is. Whether or not that's true, we don't really know. So Joe, what's my scale, man?
So we've got some fun scales, and one of them I got a small story about. So the first one that was going to be possibly it is Jesus backpacks, because that's a cool backpack that Jesus is carrying. And the quick story on that is I heard the leather maker who made a lot of the leather products for the show. I mean, thousands and thousands of dollars worth of leather goods that he provided for the show. And when Dallas invoiced him or sent or asked for the invoice came back with a zero. He's like, look, this is me giving my loaves and fishes. Like, I want to support what's going on. So I thought that was really cool. So Jesus backpack, but that's not what we're going to go with. We were going to go with jars of water because I thought that was a good one. But ultimately, this one really is centered around Jacob's wells. So we're going to go with Jacob's wells.
Okay. of Jacob's wells, if we're taking all of the scriptural context into consideration, I'm going to give it a 4. Now, we see a lot of the scriptural elements that are portrayed here, particularly the conversation that Jesus has with the woman at the well, her name notwithstanding, that they stuck not just to what was said in the scripture, but also I think they did a wonderful job of making that portrayal, the tone, or to make it match the tone with which it was written in the book of John, which I think was beautifully done and really does bring that part of the story, which is the central focus, to light. With some of the other things, the one Jacob's well that's missing has to do with some of the poetic license that they took in some of these scenarios. Though I think it helps to further the storyline. It's enough outside of the scriptural context that I can't give it a full 5.
Got it. Well, that's fair enough. It's good. Yeah, there for me, as far as the storytelling goes, you guys are not going to be surprised that if I could give it a 10 out of 5, I'd give it that. This is absolutely a 5 out of 5 from the storytelling perspective. There are so many moments throughout this episode that I think were really impactful. Lucas, you kind of alluded to that earlier. The heartbreaking moment for me, watching Nicodemus again after having a conversation with his wife, and she's like, what does she call him, Nico or something like that? She's like, I love our life, take me back to our life. And he's sitting there, the conflict that exists in his mind as he's like, yes, I love our life, and there's this amazing thing that I'm seeing happen. This is after he's talked to Jesus, and cloaked at night, so that he's got to be an absolute mess, I could only imagine. And so to see him give this gift, knowing that in his heart, I think he knows this is not what this is what I perceived. This is not what I was supposed to give. He asked me to follow him. And again, I know that's extra biblical, but from a storytelling perspective, it's just spot on. So he's sitting there weeping, and Jesus is like disappointed, So I thought, such a good moment. I also thought it was interesting the way they portrayed Jesus when the Pharisees come up to the party. And they're like, they just can't even believe that this ruckus is going on. And Jesus doesn't look angry with them. He looks disappointed. Like in my notes, I was like, he looked disappointed in them, not angry with them. And I thought that was a really interesting way to portray that moment. I love, Matthew just being such a lovable character in the story, when Gaius, comes up and he's like, you can see that Gaius actually cares for Matthew. And he's like, what are you doing, man? Like, you're throwing, he's like your uncle who just cares about you. He's like, what are you doing with your life, man? He just can't even believe what's going on. So I think there's an interesting development, with Gaius that's going on. I think we'll see that. I think in season 4, I'm guesstimating that we're going to see Gaius have a pretty cool moment as well. I absolutely loved when Jesus was talking to Eden before healing her mom, and he's like, a normal Simon's hard enough to deal with. Can you imagine a worried Simon? So it's just like there's maybe even some practicality that's going into
and
that.
then that's also the humor, right? And the sarcasm of it,
Totally.
And it's like, Eden looks at him with this like, yeah, you're absolutely right. I've been around anxious Simon before. It's not good, and I can understand that. So
right.
Yeah. It fits
well. And even like, when they're tearing down the camp, I think some of the ways that they have chosen to address like theological, tough theological things, like, when Simon's talking to him and he's like, Jesus is like, what's going on in your mind? He's like, you're telling me you don't already know what's in my head? And Jesus goes, that's a topic for another time. It's like, some of the ways that they deal with some of these things, I think is really smart. Another moment early when they're kind of going around, this is kind of just like an offhanded comment, but somebody says, you healed Lil, right? Referencing Mary's previous name. And Mary says, it's Mary. She goes, it's Mary now. And Jesus goes, always was. So I just think there's some really cool storytelling that's going on even in these little tiny moments. But for me, as the story develops, and David, I'd love to hear your perspective on this when we get to your with the historical context. The fact that they chose to go the route to Jerusalem that they chose, is that geographically, is that accurate, that it would have been shorter to go a different way? I don't know. So like,
No, it would have
absolutely
been
through
shorter to go through Samaria.
Samaria. So
Right.
like,
So
it's
you've
portrayed
got
properly.
Galilee here, you've got Judea and Jerusalem here, and you've got Samaria basically in the middle with that. And so it's not 100% certain that they would have been forbidden. I think that's the way that it's sort of being portrayed, is that
Right.
it was like a Jew's forbidden to go through Samaria. I don't think that that's the case. But the reality is, if when you study ancient Jewish writings, they would cross over the Jordan River, come alongside the Jordan on the far side, down into the Dead Sea area to Jericho, and then from Jericho up into Jerusalem to avoid
Samaria.
having gone through Samaria and having to be around Samaritans or engaging with them in any way, shape, or form. And
Right.
so when they bring that context in and the disciples are like, we've got to go this way, and Jesus is like, no, we're going to go through there, and they don't like the way that is, and they're concerned about it. There's a lot there that seems likely pretty accurate.
Right. Yeah. So that I just thought the storytelling element of that is stellar as well, where it's just like, they just can't believe, like, and I think Jesus even says something like, he goes, if you're gonna stop and ask me every time we've got a decision that you don't understand, this is gonna be very frustrating for all of us.
That hurts too.
Yeah.
That's like such a direct personal application where
Right.
God's like, I don't have to tell you about tomorrow or next week or next year. I just need you to obey today. And it was like, yeah, watching that was huge. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was, again, storytelling as far as Jacob's Wells go. This is a 5 out of 5 Jacob's Wells. If I could give it more, I would. I would take the extra one from Lucas and add it to mine, just to make it. So, fun episode. I was really looking forward to you guys watching this one too, getting your thoughts. So, David, talk to us about your thoughts about the episode and the historical accuracy here.
I think that there's so much in there. I've already mentioned stuff about Matthew and the dinner, and I think that we've already sort of talked enough about that on previous episodes about the connection between Matthew and the other disciples and how that would be. And I know that that's going to end up playing a part into some future storytelling that they're going to do, and that relationship there. I loved. They didn't go down this path into detail, but they did with the woman at Mount Gerizim, Jacob's Well, in Samaria. They captured what I would have felt like the Samaritan woman, her perspective on their religious differences would have been with it. And yes, I mean, we've already talked about it from a narrative perspective, the sarcasm and the back and forth and all of that was huge. But from a narrative perspective, they didn't go down the path of trying to get into too much weeds with what that was, but they captured that there's a big difference here. And I think that for us, we can take a second to understand a little bit of the differences there. We know, most of us know about Samaritans. We know that they were hated by the Jews. We know that they hated the Jews. We've kind of got that context from all of the stories in the Gospels that reference the Jews and Samaritans and their interactions. But we don't necessarily understand the origin of the Samaritans, and we don't understand their religious differences that much. We don't talk about that as much, and we have to really understand kind of where this is. The Samaritans were birthed out of the original destruction of the 10 northern tribes back 700 years before all of this. They, the 10 northern tribes, the kingdom of Israel after the kingdom was divided, they were conquered by the Assyrians, and their practice within the Assyrian Empire was to transplant the population and scatter them among the empire and do the same thing, right? Bring people from other nations and other empires, bring them in there, and the purpose behind it would be to weaken the nationalism within the people, right? So if you left the northern tribes in their land unified together and just tried to subjugate them, then the likelihood is they're going to rise up, they're going to try to create independence again, all of this. But if you pull them out, scatter them all throughout the empire, take other people from all around the empire and set them in that land and leave them there, then you don't have that problem anymore. They have to figure out how to survive, and that's the most important piece, right? And build their new communities and all of this. And so this is what happens when you read in Kings and in Chronicles, Second Kings, Second Chronicles. This is what happens with the Assyrians. The problem is the people keep getting attacked by, it's like lions is what it says. And so the Assyrian rulers are like, maybe the gods of this region are angry about this whole situation, so they bring in priests that had been scattered around. They bring them in and they establish them as, we got to make sure that this god of this area is being appeased. So let's bring in these priests and let them create a new version of their religion, which wasn't a hard thing to do in that area because these priests were so corrupt already that just bringing them in and giving them a job and telling them, make this the God Yahweh and go after it, is what ended up happening. And so as part of that, they latched on to some things that had happened within that kingdom, and they made their own version of the Torah, the Samaritan Pentateuch. Most people don't realize this, but the oldest physical copy of a Torah-like document is not the traditional Torah that we have today, that, within Judaism and Christianity and things like that, even ancient Jewish writings. The oldest version of it is the Samaritan Pentateuch, and it's actually housed right now on Mount Gerizim, where this all took place, where Jacob's well is. And for the most part, it matches up with the Hebrew scriptures, line by line, except in their 10 commandments, they twist one, and they change one of the 10 commandments. I don't remember which one they take out. But they say, you will worship God only on Mount Gerizim.
Wow.
With that. And so that's the context of this entire conversation. And this woman, Fatina, or whatever her name was, that she knows these laws, right? And so they had taken and they had inbred, and it was some Jews and some Gentiles had inbred, and they had this distorted version of the Torah and this distorted version of the worship of Yahweh, and that's why they were so hated by this. And so when Jesus and this woman are having this back and forth about, well, yeah, you Jews say we have to worship in Jerusalem at the temple, but our writings say that we should worship only here. They're referencing all of those things.
Wow.
And all of that's being pulled into it. And so
I
don't know that. What's that?
It's the 10th commandment.
Is it the 10th commandment that they replaced?
Yep.
So they take out, what is the commandment regarding covet?
Mm-hmm.
And they replace it with, you will worship only on Mount Gerizim.
Yeah, it shall be when you are passed over the Jordan that you shall set up these stones which I have commanded you on this day in Mount Gerizim. There you shall build an altar to Yahweh your God, an altar of stones, and you shall lift up no iron tool, and yada yada. But that's it.
So this is the context of the conversation, and Jesus knows all of this, and this woman knows all of this, and they have this back and forth, and it's a religious debate. And she's like, I know our Torah, and I know your Torah, and I know the differences here. And so that sarcasm that I read into the passage actually plays into this. And then, when Jesus starts, speaking into, you've been married 5 times and the man you're with now is not your husband. And she's like, oh yeah, you're a prophet, right? Big deal. With all of that, that's the way I read it with it. And so I found that the context was absolutely beautiful. And I also don't see, when I read the passage, this like light from heaven moment that I feel like we've so placed on this, where she's like, this is the Messiah, and she runs back and she's all of this. I think that I kind of read it as she goes back to Samaria, or to the village, to Gerizim there, and she goes back and she's like, I think I just met the Messiah. She's still trying to figure it out. And then the religious leaders come and they're questioning, and you read in the John 4 passage with it. And this isn't going to be the last time that we go to this location in the scriptures. They go back through this, depending on where you find this in whatever version of the chronology that you're trying to lay at this. They're going to go back through Samaria. They're going to go through this village again on the way to Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. And the people are going to reject Jesus in that moment, because he won't worship there with them. Their religion becomes more important to them than the Messiah. And so all of that was great. I would say for a rating on this, I'm going to give it 4.5, just because they captured so much of that perfection within that story there that I thought was beautiful.
That's awesome.
I've got a question for you, David, and
Sure.
And Joe, you can weigh in on this as well. One of the things about the portrayal of Fatina that hung with me, and that is sort of on this borderline of, did they really match with biblical content and cultural context? When she goes and gives this guy the writ of divorce, because when we look at the story in John 4, it says, you have no husband, and the man that you're living with is not your husband, right? That would mean, quite literally, that she was not married, which is not one of those things that I think Jesus would like gloss over the technicality of, like, no, technically she was married and she was trying to get a divorce from this guy, the way that they portray her in there. So am I missing something? Does he actually sign the divorce papers and give them to her? Because if I remember right, he just throws them right into the fire, which means that she would, in the context of the show, that she would still be married. And so my question then to David is, from a cultural perspective, because she's living with someone else, does that mean that she's divorced this other man, even though he hasn't like given her that writ of divorce?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I would have to, if I was looking at it from a Jewish legal perspective, I think that certificate of divorce, she's an adulteress,
Right.
in this moment. But the certificate of divorce was a huge conversation within ancient Judaism of the first century, and having that document in place would have been huge. So I would think that if that's the context that they're trying to set up for why the man that she's living with now is not her husband, right? So they're trying to set up this idea of she would marry this man she's with now, but she physically or legally can't, because this previous husband is refusing to give her a certificate of divorce, and so legally she can't marry this one, and so that's why she's with him. I think that's the way I took it, but I wouldn't know if they went any further with that or why.
Okay, yeah. So I took it the same way, and this is one of those things from a biblical context perspective. When we look at verses, 17 and 18, or sorry, let's go 16 through 18. Jesus says to her, "Go call your husband," he told her, "and come back here." "I don't have a husband," she answered. "You've answered correctly. And when you said, 'I don't have a husband,' Jesus said, 'For you've had 5 husbands, and the man you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true.'" That would mean that the portrayal in the show is inaccurate. And I wanted to ask this question before I, kind of went down this hole. Is inaccurate because she would not have had even that husband in order for those statements in verses 17 to 8, or that interaction from 16 to 18 would for that to be accurate. And this is one of the little things that kind of stood out to me and irked me. And I was like, you know what? I want to make sure that there's nothing like culturally that I'm missing within this. I didn't see anything within the context of the research that I'd done, but I wanted to double check with you. Because that also like has a substantial effect on how I would rate this in particular, because that would be one of those things that, like, this isn't poetic license. Like, this is one of the things that the show got wrong. And And that would be a shift for me. And it really would be the first thing that I would look at and say, no, they got this wrong. This isn't a gray area. This isn't, something where I think poetic license or directorial liberty or whatever we want to call it would end up in a place where like that's okay. And I could see that happening. Like this would be no, they got this wrong. And it's one of those things that like it would be I'm looking at it and it seems like a pretty glaring bad call. And so I want to get y'all's thoughts on it.
Joe, what do you think?
Well, from a storytelling perspective, this would show that the man who she gave the piece of paper to, who was sitting by the fire, that was her fifth husband, right? That's kind of the assumption, because she's off with another man, and he was saying, oh, I thought maybe you'd bring him by so I could see him before you got tired of him too. That was kind of the what was being portrayed in the show. So this would say that man was her, according to scripture, the fifth husband, right? And the one that she's with now, we don't even meet, we don't even see in the show. But what you're saying is, like, in scripture, what it says is that she's not married current, like she is not married.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. I don't see it as intensely as I think you do, Lucas. I would see that the conversation is loaded with people trying to dance around her issue, right? And so she's like, I don't have a husband. And Jesus says, well, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you've had 5, right?
Yeah.
The man you're with now is not your husband. So I don't necessarily see it as like a legal interpretation that he's making there. I see it more as he's like, yeah, let's talk this through a little bit with it. And so I don't know if I would have felt as intensely about that if I was, involved in the planning of this episode and the scripting and not that I would ever be asked to be the consultant that deals with some of this stuff for them, but if I was, I don't know if I would have felt intensely about that like you do.
Well, and some of it is like going beyond just the facts. And I think this is what's portrayed as like, and Jesus, and they show Fatina earlier going through the market and she picks up the oranges, right? And then, later when she's talking to Jesus and she's kind of stating the facts of, you've had these, and like you mentioned, David, she's like, oh, you're a prophet, right? But then when he mentions how she felt and the smells, that it's like, that's not like, that's a whole different level of feeling, that somehow that really impacted her, not the fact that he could have asked anyone in the town and found out that she had 5 husbands. Like, the people would have known who she was, right? And I don't know how common or uncommon it would be to be married and divorced that number of times. Maybe that's an uncommon thing, and that says something about her character. But I think for me, again, the thing that's interesting is Jesus yet again comes to the unlikely choice, to reveal this. Like, 1, he's in Samaria. 2, it's a woman. 3, it's a woman not of, like, I don't think, great repute. So all of a sudden it's like we see Jesus coming to the uncommon, with this revelation. So
yeah, I definitely don't think it takes away from the moment or anything like that. But from a purely like creative perspective, this seems like the first time in the series where I would point to something and say, that was a misstep. Like, that's if you take that scene out, the story doesn't suffer. But with that scene present, now you've created something that can, at the very least, be a bit confusing when you're looking at the biblical text versus what is portrayed, and enough so that we're having a conversation about it where the 3 of us are having to use things like, I don't know, in the context of that, which, not that every story has to be that black and white, but sometimes with scripture, it is, and it's necessary that it is. So yeah, that scene, I think we could have completely done without, and that it doesn't affect the story, the narrative at all. It doesn't move it forward anymore. It doesn't affect the moment. That's one of those really interesting creative decisions that they made where I'm like, this is, of everything we've seen in the first season, of the Christmas episode and all of this stuff that we've talked about that was like totally extra biblical, even in this scene or in this episode with the scene with Nicodemus. Um, like all of those things are plausible. This is the one that I look at and I'm like, you know what? I think this is the one thing so far this season that you guys have actually that you probably got wrong. And it does it's one of those things that when I look at it, I'm like, it wasn't a necessary thing for you to try and do. So yeah, the curiosity there, why it happened and whether or not it lines up, that's one that's my only like heavy sticking point for this episode where it kind of eyebrow for me.
Unless down the road in a future episode, they're going to show the restoration of a marriage that even when you've asked for a bill of divorce, you can still find where Jesus can heal a marriage.
Not line up with the things I've read about, who's like
right.
still like at a monastery somewhere. It's bizarre.
Well, let's talk about the moment. So I know we've all talked about there's numerous moments in this episode, but Lucas, for you, what was the moment for you?
Man, I think for me the moment is Nicodemus. And I know that it comes in the middle of the episode, that it's not really the focal point of it, but I think the moment is Nicodemus for me because I think at times in my life that I've felt that the only thing, I've been throughout the course of my adulthood really been consistent with giving my tithes and offerings. I have not always been consistent with giving my heart, and that's kind of what I'm seeing from Nicodemus is like, yeah, I want to participate, I want to help out with what you're doing, but I can't commit myself to it, and I'm torn. It's also one of the things I think I see most often as a pastor is people that they know that if they go all in, the fulfillment that they will have, but the troubles and things that they have and that they're dealing with in their lives, or maybe it's family stuff, or maybe it's the life that they enjoy. Those things keep them from pursuing ministry. Maybe it keeps them from pursuing service, or, in a couple of cases that are, incredibly heartbreaking, it's kept them from like truly repenting and believing and making a commitment to Christ, because they're like, you know what? I feel like if I do this, my life is going to be radically changed. Like, yeah, absolutely it will. And like, I don't think I can handle a radical life change. It's like, oh, you're kidding. Like, no, I don't think I can do it. And that heartbreak is one that I know that a lot of those folks have experienced as we've had conversations, and people are heartbroken over their inability to make a decision to follow Christ. And so that, of everything that happened in this episode, that's the one that got me, because I was like, that pain that Nicodemus is feeling, I felt. But also I meet people in my office or in our community on a not necessarily a weekly basis, but several times a month, that's it, that they're like, you know what, I want to follow Jesus with everything I have, but I just can't give up, these other things, or it would be too radical a change, and my family can't handle it or whatever. And yeah, and it's heartbreaking. So I think that was a beautiful portrayal of what that actually looks like. And that was it for me. And so that's a 5 out of 5, because again, from a pastoral perspective and from a preaching perspective, that's something that, I've directed people toward over the last, the course of the last couple of weeks, as I've seen that episode, and they're like, I don't know about this. And I'm like, you should watch this. This guy, I think, is going through kind of what you're going through. And I've had one of those people reach back out to me, and they were like, yeah, that's it. I feel like I'm on the wall on the other side, like doing what I think I can, but not giving Jesus myself. And I feel like I just need to crumple and cry. Well, that's it's a wonderful thing to be able to have a visual representation of what they're feeling. And so that's it for me.
That's good. David, how about for you? What was the moment for you?
Oh man, it's hard to pick a moment in this episode because it's kind of start to finish, right? And
Mhm.
so, we've got those, but I know I brought this relationship in as my moment a few episodes ago when after Peter, the call of Peter to be Jesus' disciple, and the next episode he goes home and he's talking with Eden, and he's worried that Eden is going to have concerns or challenges to him following Jesus. And she's like, I believed in you all along. I knew that, this is who you are. That was my moment from that episode. I feel like in this one, it's that same interaction, just because, with having been in full-time, vocational church ministry, part-time, full-time ministry with with parachurch organizations, having picked up and moved my family all over the country multiple times, including one time where we never got home because we were in an RV for a long time. I blame you, Joe. With that, all of those types of things, the relationship between Simon and Eden is pretty special. And I see such compassion and understanding in Jesus in that moment, by them repositioning that tiny little series of 3 verses or whatever it is in Matthew and in Luke, and in Mark, I think it's in all the synoptics, where Peter's mother-in-law is healed. It's just a facts insert in scripture, but building a story around that and a reason behind it, and uh, and helping us in a context of that relationship see, yeah, it would have been really, really challenging for Peter to give up everything and follow Jesus, knowing that his wife was back in Capernaum dealing with the imminent death of her mother. And that would have been challenging. And sometimes Jesus comes in our lives and he brings resolution to those things, so that we don't have to face them, which is what we see in this version of the story. But then there are other times where Jesus doesn't. Jesus leaves us in that tension and that struggle, and says, but will you follow still? Will you still, come with me on this journey? And I'm not going to make things easier. And I loved the way that they did it in the story, but a moment like this makes me step back and think, that made it easier for Simon. And man, there's some times in my life where God's done that. But there are also times where he hasn't shown up and healed my mother-in-law in that metaphorically. And he still asks me to follow. And so it just caused me to step back and think about those types of things. So I'd give that, I give the whole episode, when it comes to all of the different moments, a 5 out of 5, but that was the one that stood out.
That's great. Yeah, I share the same moment. That it was a close second for Nicodemus, that moment where he's, just weeping, at the wall there. But the moment for me was the woman at the well, when Fortina, when they're really having that dialogue, and she's like, so it's not going to be about the mountains and the temples. And he's like, soon, just about the heart. And I that whole interchange. And then when she goes away, change, and she's like, I'm going to tell everyone about you. And he's like, I'm counting on that. Like that moment. It's like, I think there's a certain part of the ongoing story of the gospel and of Jesus that is easy to be missed. And that is like, God is counting on us to continue to share this word with people. He can reveal it to people. And we've seen stories of this. I know a lot of the time that I've spent in Israel, like talking about Muslim people who are having visions of Jesus and like coming to Christ in the thousands. So God does, it's not a requirement that we're part of that, but he asks us to be part of that story. And we have that story, and we can be like the woman at the well, going and telling everyone about it too. So I think for me, that was the moment, and it was a 5 out of 5. I feel like it's hard for me not to get choked up watching that whole interplay there. And then the comedic relief when the disciples come back and he says, I have food for you that you do not even know of. So it's a great episode. So what does that leave us, Lucas? What's the tally on this episode?
28 and a half with the season finale.
Is that one of our highest ones?
Definitely one of the highest ones. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think
Okay.
we've had a perfect 30 yet. But I think 28.5, we might have had a 29. But I think 28.5.
I don't think we have. I think 27.5 was probably our
Yeah, yeah,
highest, if I'm
Yeah, so
recalling
this
it.
might be the highest so far. So not surprisingly, it's great. Is a great great season. It was a great season finale episode. So we'll make sure to join us on our next episode where we're going to talk about overall impressions of season one. We'll do like a season one recap, right, guys? So it'll be a fun. I think that'll be a fun episode to having digested everything we have from this whole season, coming back to that. So Lucas, how can people be part of the conversation here?
Make sure that you check out the Bible Nerd Show Facebook group if you want to chat with us about the things that we've got going on, about our opinions of it, or drop us a comment on our YouTube channel. Is probably the best way to get our attention. Let us know, do you really think this lady's name was Fatina? Do you think that The Chosen got it wrong with whether or not she was still married to that fifth husband? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to be able to chat with you about it.
Awesome. Well, until next time, stay in the Word and stay nerdy.